Good evening. I'm Christine Cuiava, Director of the Bismarck Veterans Memorial Public Library. Welcome and thank you for attending our event, Writing on North Dakota. We appreciate that you support the library's programs and services and our commitment to providing personal enrichment to all. Before I pass the mic over to our moderator this evening, this event is sponsored by the Bismarck Library Foundation and funded in part by Humanities North Dakota, a nonprofit, independent, state partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views expressed this evening do not necessarily reflect those of Humanities North Dakota or the National Endowment for the Humanities. Our moderator this evening is Amy Sisk. Amy is a journalist with an impressive resume that includes DC-based Politico and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania's public radio station, WESA. She is currently the energy reporter at the Bismarck Tribune, and we're so appreciative that she's here with us this evening. Please welcome our event moderator, Amy Sisk.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Christine. As Christine mentioned, I'm Amy Sisk. I'm the energy reporter at the Bismarck Tribune. And being a journalist, I prepared just a million questions for tonight. There's no way that we're going to get through all of them. But I did want to let those of you in the audience know that we do plan to leave a few minutes at the end for questions from you as well. So feel free to be thinking of some as Clay and as Sarah speak. I also wanted to just take a minute to introduce those up here on stage with me. We'll start with Sarah Vogel. She's written a memoir, The Farmer's Lawyer, which came out last month. The book is about her experience as an attorney representing farmers facing foreclosure in the 1980s. She filed a class action lawsuit on their behalf, and the case would eventually cover 240,000 farmers nationwide. Sarah went on to be elected state agriculture commissioner in 1988. She was the first woman to serve in that role in the United States. Sarah has since continued to work as an attorney and as an advocate for farmers and for North Dakota. Clay Jenkinson recently published his latest book, The Language of Cottonwoods. It's a collection of essays on the future of North Dakota. It touches on our state's eccentricities, like Salem Sioux, and the debate over which town can truly claim to be the center of North America. Clay's essays also reflect on more serious topics, like oil development in the Bakken and North Dakota's relationship with Native Americans. Clay is a humanities scholar, and he hosts the nationally syndicated radio program, the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Sarah and Clay, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so I figured we would kind of start with the softball. I think I wanted to ask both of you guys the same question. We'll start with you, Sarah. I'm really just curious what inspired you to write this book here, The Farmer's Lawyer.
When I was doing the case, I grew to recognize that it was a really big deal. It was a very important case. And it had, and I knew that someday I would want to communicate it and not just in briefs to a judge. But I didn't keep a diary. I was thinking throughout that whole time, I said, I should keep a diary. But I didn't keep a diary, I didn't have time to keep a diary. So instead, I saved every scrap of paper that crossed my desk or came into my mailbox. All the old bills, the phone messages, the draft briefs, I saved it all. And I put it all in boxes because I was busy. After the case was over, I went down and was an assistant attorney general, then ag commissioner, then private practice. And like my last case, my last big class action, also against USDA, also arising out of the same situations as in the 80s, was on behalf of Native American farmers and ranchers. And instead of taking like 2 years, it took 19 years and 9 months to wrap up. But throughout this time, I put all my papers, thank goodness, over in the archives. Love the archives. My goodness, they're heroes. And so they had all my papers. And I was waiting for a historian to waltz through North Dakota and discover these papers and say, I need to write a book about that. But it didn't happen, and didn't happen for decades. And so eventually I decided I had to do it. And then I also decided that I could not practice law full-time with a law firm and all that. So I gradually separated myself from the law firm and then tried to devote myself full-time to writing this book. That was about 10 years ago I made that decision. So 1 month ago, it came out. These things take time.
All right, and Clay, this is your book here, The Language of Cottonwoods. Now, this is not your first book, but please tell us what prompted you to write this one.
I'm a North Dakotan. I love this state with all my heart. I've had a chance to travel quite a bit around the country and around the world, and there's no place that speaks to my heart the way North Dakota does. And I've spent a lot of my life thinking about North Dakota and trying to understand it. And I find some of it perplexing. I think North Dakota is an acquired taste, and not for everyone. And there are things about North Dakota that I think are changing very fast. And just let me just say quickly what an honor it is to share the stage with Sarah Vogel. I've been an admirer of her all of my adult life, and I think she's an agrarian hero. And our books have some shared elements, and if I can just quickly say what they are. First of all, we both have a deep love of family farming and believe that that is what created the character of North Dakota. And now that it is changing as fast as it is and slipping away in some important regards, I see that as a terrible loss and even a catastrophe. So that's number one. Number two, we both have an interest in agrarian protest movements, dating back to the populists and to the nonpartisan league, and you are a living embodiment of that tradition. And although I don't write much about the NPL in this book, I really believe that North Dakotans have to fight for what's magnificent in this state. And the third commonality, I think, is that we both understand that the 80s were the most traumatic decade in North Dakota history, more than the Great Depression, for lots of interesting reasons, I think. And you were right at the center of that. And I remember, and I can read a passage later if it ever comes to that, but billboards all over the state, suicide hotlines, pastors going off to seminars to learn how to help farmers get through this agonizing period, out-migration, parents, grandparents, pastors, high school principals, and teachers and advisors telling young people, leave, go find your destiny somewhere else. And I think that that created a trauma, and I use this term advisedly, but I think we're still living through a kind of post-traumatic stress, which is why we were so unchallenging when the Bakken oil boom swept through the state. And so I think that the 80s are still haunting us to a certain degree, and your book is right at the heart of that, not only North Dakota, but national catastrophe. So I wrote the book because I love this place and want to try to understand it.
That's a good segue into what I wanted to ask you next, Sarah. Can you talk with us about what factors really led to this farm crisis in the 1970s and 1980s?
I would say, well, but by the way, I'm not at all an ag economist. I hated ag economists because ag economists were always saying, this is the way it is, farmers are going down, you know, blah, 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 blah. So but I would say that the 1970s and the very, very good times in the 1970s were a big factor in the 80s. Prices were good. There were big purchases of wheat and other crops from Russia. And then there were, you know, good weather, and things were very, very good. I think the value overall of agriculture products pretty much doubled during the 70s. And I still have clippings from like early 81 saying, everything is great, everything is going up. 3 months later, it's like, what's happened? And what happened is that the Federal Reserve and Ronald Reagan took certain steps with regard to taxes and so on. And there were very, very high interest rates and suddenly very low prices because the farmers blamed the failure of the Russian, well, not the failure, but Carter stopped sales to Russia of wheat, and that was a cataclysmic change. I think it was papered over by more money from the federal government and so on. But then the kicker came when Ronald Reagan picked David Stockman as his Office of Management Budget, and he did not believe in farmers, family farmers. He believed in survival of the fit, and he thought all these farmers who had become delinquent well, he didn't even believe in the idea that the federal government should be lending to farmers. But his way of biting off that particular problem was to start at a quota on collection of farmers who were delinquent. And it was 25%, and he announced it, I think, in the fall of 81, and he said these delinquencies had to be reduced by 25% in every state, 23, 24%. And then by the following March, well, you know, nobody was going to have another crop. Nobody was going to be able to plant or do anything about it. And this machine just rose up and it started to shut farmers down, shut them down. It was happening all over the country. North Dakota's delinquency rate back then was 42%. We were in the middle of the pack. From Texas to California, it was more than that. So it was cataclysmic and happened very fast. And then so the tender was there, and then David Stockman threw this match on it, and it was awful. And I was actually, Becky Jones, who was a journalist at the time, I remember her walking across the street and she had a piece of paper in her hand. She'd gotten it from Ralph Lee's office. She said, look at this. And I looked at it. It was like, oh my God. Anyway, it was bad. It was set off. It was a decision that was made, and David Stockman really didn't care. I was a little worried, I'm talking too long. I was a little worried about being sued for slander or libel. But the lawyer for the publisher assured me that David Stockman was a public figure. But nonetheless, all of the nasty things I say about David Stockman in my book, they're all from his books. Direct quotations from him, or his memos, or speeches that he gave at the time. He was a villain.
Well, being a journalist, I understand the fear of being sued first. Clay, you also write about this era and what was happening to farmers in your book, and you have this line, you say, North Dakota lost its confidence during this era. Can you talk more about how that came to be?
Well, I think it was a kind of perfect storm. The 70s had been kind of a boom time. In fact, 1973 was one of the great profitable years in the history of agriculture in the United States. And if you drive the state, you can see all the new houses that were built on farms in 1974 and 1975. And we thought this would never end. And the Cold War was coming to an end. We would have new markets in the former Soviet bloc. And there was a time of great optimism. So that was the setup, because we had such a sense that the future was ours. And then this perfect storm happened. The drought came, and it was a severe one. The farm economy collapsed. I was married then to a Kansas farm woman, and her parents were thrown off the land essentially by the 21% interest rates that briefly occurred at the intersection of the Carter and Reagan administration. So there was that, the farm credit crisis and the collapse of commodity prices. And then the oil boom collapsed at the same time. And so this threw North Dakota into an economic depression, but also I think a spiritual depression. And I remember when George Sinner was governor, that the legislature would meet and fund K through 12 and then go home because there was no money to do anything else. And when we celebrated the centennial of North Dakota in 1989, I think there was widespread concern that we might not really have a bicentennial, what was the future of this place? And so I think that's really important. I think we lost a generation of young people who went away because they just felt there was nothing here for them. But I also feel, because I'm so concerned about the industrialization of our landscape now, that it weakened our resolve to fight for ourselves when economic boom came. That the sense was, we can't look cross-eyed at industry lest it leave and we go back into our sort of deplorable state. Because remember, just before the boom, there was that article in National Geographic, The Empty Prairie, do you remember that? And it was all about eastern Montana and western North Dakota. And North Dakotans kind of got upset and went nuts over this because it was like presenting us as sort of a dying place. That's how we felt secretly. That's why we were so angry at National Geographic. And then suddenly the Bakken oil boom comes, and in some ways it's an economic miracle. In some ways it's yet another episode in the extraction history of the Great Plains. And so I think that's my main thesis here, is that we need to develop a stronger conservation ethos in the state of North Dakota, because I believe that our one true sacred place, the Badlands and the Little Missouri River Valley, are on the auction block because we don't know better.
I have a little vignette I'd like to add to that. Before I came back to North Dakota in 81, 82, kind of when things were starting to get bad, I'd been at the Department of Treasury, and I was a special assistant to the Secretary of Treasury. Very fancy job. And hanging out with the assistant secretaries and the deputy secretaries and on the inside, and this is under the Democrats, the good guys. They had several areas of the United States identified as energy sacrifice areas. I don't know that this ever was publicized much, and one of them was western North Dakota, another one was Four Corners. And I remember standing in the hallway arguing vociferously that this should never happen to western North Dakota because of its beauty, and it was pretty, and the farmers would never stand for it.
That was then.
Yeah, well, I think that still is the case. I mean, Badlands Conservation Alliance, Northern Plains, out of Montana, Dakota Resource Council, those are all founded by farmers. You know, they started with farmers saying, no, we don't want to have our barbed wire fences dissolved by the fumes coming out of these things. So I think the spirit is still there, but boy, the protection of the politicians was very much lacking. Except for Art Link.
Well, I was going to say, you say energy sacrifice some, but in the film we got to make about Art Link,
Yeah.
When the Landscape is Quiet Again, which you're in, we found footage of him addressing the legislature and saying in his strongest tone, we are not going to let North Dakota become an energy sacrifice zone.
Exactly. He was an MPLer too, you know. But yeah, I mean, but that spirit of Art Link is not in our government, no.
How do you guys think that, what do you guys think that North Dakotans ought to do to try to change our mindset around conservation?
You got to get out there. You know, you can't love what you don't know. And when I wrote my book, I did the demographic analysis, and 60% of North Dakotans live from Jamestown East. And most of them never get to the Badlands, and if they say they did, they meant Medora Musical. I have no criticism of the Medora Musical, but it's not the Badlands. And so they don't know it. And so when I take people to the Elkhorn Ranch, which is in a remote place even today, Theodore Roosevelt's second ranch in the Badlands, 35 miles north of Medora, they invariably say, I had no idea it was this isolated and beautiful, and we must protect this, but you can't protect what you don't know. And so we need documentary films, we need more books, we need busloads of people. I think in my book I say that every new hire at UND, NDSU, and all the other of the 11 state institutions should go through an orientation week where they get out into the pothole country and to the Pembina Gorge and to the Badlands and to the Butte country, because they come here and they're some of the best scholars in the world. It's a buyer's market. But they're sort of hovering on the Minnesota border, leaning out, not in. And at our enormous taxpayer cost, they're teaching our children how to think about this place.
I love that idea.
But you got the power to make it happen.
All right. I wanted to go back to the farm crisis in the 80s. So it brings up a couple of things I wanted to ask you both about. Sarah, your book focuses on farmers' relationship with the Farmers' Home Administration, which is this part of the federal government. Can you talk about what farmers' relationship was supposed to look like with this agency, but then what happened and how did that change?
I actually brought a little book. A Brief History of the Farmers' Home Administration.
Are you going to read it to us?
No, I'm not. But it was started, I'm not going to find it. Okay, I will. With the Farmers' Home Administration was started in the darkest days of the early FDR administration. And at that point, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of people on the roads, they were tractored out of they called it tractored out, but they'd already lost their farms, they were promised they could keep renting them. And then the landlords, who are big agribusinesses, said, you're out, and they would tractor down, they'd destroy the house. And North Dakota was one of the most hard-hit states in that whole process. There a lot more writing got done about Oklahoma and other states, but North Dakota, I think under many writers, many data, said that North Dakota was the worst. And then in the middle of all of that, President Roosevelt issued an executive order, and he created something called the Resettlement Administration. And the Resettlement Administration was supposed to take the farmers who had, or the people who were doing crop share down in the South, and give them homes and set them up as farm owners. They were making loans. They were providing food. We had mattress factories in North Dakota where women were given jobs. There's some really excellent stuff done on North Dakota in the 30s. And this was all farmers' home. And they were making loans. And they had a sort of teams. It was a farm, somebody with farm background, usually a man, and then a woman who was like a social worker, a home ec person. And they would work together. And they helped the farmers, first of all, they got a loan, then they set up, like, how are you going to do your home, well, how are you going to have a garden, here's how you do this, here's how you do that, and they have very, very, very low cost, very, very patient credit. And over the years, Farmers Home had almost a zero loan loss because of the way that they did this credit. The leader of it was a guy by the name of Rexford Tugwell, And among his other hires was Dorothea Lange, because the photographer's project was part of this Resettlement Administration and had a couple other names later, but they went around the country to document the poverty so that the people of the United States would support what they were doing. And they're, you know, so they're Harry Howe, was it? No,
Harry Hopkins.
Hopkins. Harry Hopkins was one of the leaders of it, and he hired a woman by the name of Lenore Hickok.
Lenore Hickok.
Thank you.
Hick is Eleanor Roosevelt Vogel.
Yeah, and she was, my dad called her Roosevelt Spy.
Something more than that, actually.
Yeah. There's a lot of, she's a foremost woman journalist of her day. And she was going around the country, and she spent time in North Dakota. By the way, she is one of the people who said North Dakota was worse of any place in America, and she went to most of it. And they were making loans, there's seed loans, feed loans. You can see echoes of this even in the North Dakota Century Code there's a county debt adjustment boards that still exist in every county that can go in and adjust debts. But they forgot that they're there. Anyway, there's an immense amount of history, and this is one of the reasons why it took me 10 years to write this book, is I'd go into these deep dives on all this fascinating history, and I could not put it all in. But what was the question?
What went wrong with this?
That's exactly half of it. Talk about how the relationship between farmers and this Farmers Home Administration changed. Things happened that weren't so great.
Yeah, as the years went by, I think, number one, they got rid of the home ec people. The women were all let go. The Congress kept adding more and more money and not more people. So the deep involvement and supportive nature of the county supervisors was lessened. Then there's racism, great deal of racism that was interjected by the Southern senators in particular, who did not like to see the black farmers succeed. Then there was I think it got to be kind of bureaucratic. And then in the early 80s, by the early 80s, in the 70s and the early 80s, there was massive numbers of retirements. And the people that remembered what it was all about and why Farmers Home existed and how they were supposed to interact with the farmers, they started to be retired, and they were replaced by people with ag finance degrees, or maybe had studied banking and stuff like that. And the policies of Farmers Home were written in a very generous way. There was a great deal of flexibility. But with that flexibility also came a lack of protection when the bad guys, when people who are not supportive of the spirit of the Farmers Home, the original Farmers Home, were in power. There was a wonderful story in the Jamestown Sun that I can't find, and there was an interview in like about 82, 83 with two recently retired Farmers Home supervisors, county supervisors, who were saying, "But this is so wrong. Everything that is going on now is so wrong. It's unnecessary. This will not turn out well. This is not how it's supposed to be." But they had retired. I did not have a big overview in those days. I had a view from talking to individual farmers one by one who had been, like assaulted, so to speak. Like all of a sudden their lives, and some of these were multi-generational farms, that was just pulled out from under them. You see, everything The loan you thought you had 35 years to pay is due in 30 days. And your bank account has been emptied. And you can't feed your cows and you can't feed your pigs and stuff like that. And they were in shock. So I didn't have a good overview. I just saw what was happening to individuals. Somebody asked me why the title of my book is The Farmer's Lawyer with a farmer apostrophe S. And I hadn't really thought about it, but that's how I always saw it. There was like one by one farmers, not all of them, but as individuals. And they were the ones who taught me what was happening. And a lot of people who worked at Farmers Home back then, I'm now finding out, quit. They couldn't take it. They left. They went to find other work because they did not like doing what they were told they had to do.
And Clay, I was going to ask, you also write about North Dakota's relationship with the federal government, and you basically say, I'm paraphrasing here, but that many North Dakotans have adopted a somewhat negative attitude towards the federal government. And you make the case that North Dakota really has been very, very dependent on the federal government for a long time, and the relationship between farmers and the Farmers Home Administration, I think, is a good example of that. Can you just elaborate on what our relationship is with the federal government and if it ought to change?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, I'm concerned about the future of agriculture in addition to the past of agriculture. And I see some independent farmers in this audience who are sort of bucking the industrial gigantism. And I recommend a book by Beth Hoffman called Bet the Farm, which I just read.
I have that too.
And it's sort of a manifesto about non-traditional, non-industrialized agriculture. And she talks about this very problem that she and her husband in Iowa would go to the farm service people and say, we understand there is a federal program in the farm program that could help farmers like us. And the bureaucrats wouldn't know about it because it's buried on page 2000 of the farm program. And when they were reminded of it, they got kind of frustrated and huffy, as if these farmers were annoying them by not being traditional industrial agriculturalists. And so I think that the farm program is heavily weighted towards industrial gigantism and gigantic corporate farms. And I think it's a scandal that here in North Dakota, that our own Department of Agriculture doesn't have a range of special programs for young, unusual, innovative, non-traditional farmers. And I think that the State Bank of North Dakota, which was created by the Nonpartisan League to serve the people of North Dakota, should be much more proactive in helping non-traditional farmers, CSAs, farm to table, organic farms, sustainability farms, regenerative farms. And I think the USDA has done a really lousy job, particularly in most recent years, and I don't think the state government has been much better. And so it seems to me that, to go to your larger question, that North Dakotans also need to be better aware of how dependent we have been on the federal government. Lewis and Clark, sent by Thomas Jefferson as a military mission, George Custer, all the forts in North Dakota, the interstate highway system, all the programs that came out of the New Deal, the military installations in North Dakota, 2 giant SAC bases, 2 giant ICBM missile bases. North Dakota has been made possible by federal intrusions of capital and energy, and we have gotten about $1.40 for every dollar that we've ever sent into the national government. And so I think we need to know that, and I think we need to be less hypocritical about this, because we say how much we hate the federal government and how annoyed we are by government regulations, and we're at the trough every second of every day in the state of North Dakota. And we cash the checks, and I think that is a real problem, because this attitude that's been especially exacerbated and encouraged by recent political movements has made us grumpy about something that has been critical to our success. And I don't expect us to show gratitude to the national government, but we should at least be honest about our dependency. And if you take out the federal crop insurance program now, in this drought here, there would be tens of hundreds, maybe thousands of farms that would be on the edge of the same kind of bankruptcies that Sarah was fighting against in the 1980s, and they're being held up by the USDA's farm program with its crop insurance system. So we need to be honest, I think, about that.
Could I give a little pitch? Because I don't want to be negative about the Farmers Home Administration. It was under bad management at the time. But I used to tell people, I used to get in vicious arguments in coffee shops and wherever, you know. One time an ag economist came screaming out at me and spittle spraying from his mouth. He was saying I was breaking all the laws of economics. It was like, oh, anyway, I'm the biggest fan ever of the programs that are now called the Farm Service Agency, the lending programs. They're great and properly run. They're just fabulous. And another pitch I have is that back in 1985 or 86, 87, I was an assistant attorney general, and we had this consortia of assistant attorney generals. Instead of working on suing the EPA, we were working on trying to save farmers. And there was, I think, about 11 states, mostly in the Midwest, were working together. One of them was a young lawyer who was at the Oklahoma Attorney General's office. She's now the general counsel of USDA, Janie Hipp. She's a Native American, and she's done everything. She's had summer camps for kids on how to help them start farming and have business skills. And it's like, I knock on wood, and then the head of the big farmer's home, the Schumann in my book, the guy was called Charles Schumann, he got a job for an agency that he wanted to shut down. But the new guy is Zach Ducheneau, who is from the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe, and he's a regenerative rancher. And he was a farm credit counselor in the 80s and 90s and 10s and so on. And as knowledgeable a person as you could ever get. And he gets it. And he's running around the country now with his business card with his cell phone saying, "Call me." So I'm hopeful if they could just, climb those mountains. But they're now inside USDA, and they're like doing a lot of good.
Sarah, in your book, you talk a lot about challenges that you were up against in this process of representing all of these farmers. And for one, you previously hadn't been the kind of lawyer that really appeared in court before a judge at a trial, arguing a case. You were a single mother with a young son, and you were traveling a lot during this case. You yourself went into debt, and you even ended up losing your own home. There were a lot of challenges that you faced, but I'm wondering what kept you going during that time.
It was the farmers. It was the farmers. I'm getting choked up just thinking about it. I have flashbacks. But I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. And I had these legal skills, and I felt I kind of had no choice. I was a nonpartisan leader. I grew up hearing stories about how my grandfather had saved farmers in the 30s when he was the president of the Bank of North Dakota. And my dad was a lawyer for, my dad, by the way, in his whole lifetime of being a lawyer, maybe one of the best lawyers in North Dakota, he never once would represent a corporation. That's how hardcore he was. But the farmers' stories were, and when I was meeting with them in their kitchens, and they were coming to my house, and they were bringing me food, and so it just became overwhelming. But it was it was those farmers that kept me going. And I would get discouraged, and a couple times I quit. And then, like the worst time I put it in the book about when my phone was disconnected. And then farmers wanted to hire me, and I said, I can't be a lawyer because I don't have a phone. I'm like a surgeon without a hand. And they lent me the money to put the phone back in, because what they said is that we can wait to work with you because they hadn't been sued yet, but we need you. And they would, they were at the random, they would call. They'd be really, really bummed out, and there all of a sudden there would be Dwight Coleman on the phone. Hey, Sarah, how are you doing? And sometimes it was day by day, and after a while, if I would have quit, it would have been equivalent to jumping off a train going 100 miles an hour. It was impossible. I was on this train, and we were going.
I also wanted to take a few minutes to talk a bit more about the future of farming. And Clay, this is a topic that you bring up about how farms are becoming more and more automated. There are now robotics on some farms. Can you talk about what your concerns are as farms become more and more automated? And are there ways that North Dakota can, should we be worried about that? Or are there things we can do to kind of overcome some of that?
I think it's inevitable that artificial intelligence and robotics are going to sweep through North Dakota as they are everywhere else, and not just in the farming economy, but in the larger economy. If you think about what it took to build a car in, say, 1940, probably 20 people, men, worked in a plant to produce a car. And today, one man can produce, or woman can produce 20 cars because of the robotics and the automation. And so this is coming. We all know GPS guided tractors and combines and so on. I took students not so long ago to a robotic dairy near St. Anthony. And that's certainly the only way that dairies are going to be able to cash flow. And the farm service people and the bankers are going to force them to make these innovations to stay competitive. And so I think we need to have a counterweight with the State Bank of North Dakota and the State Department of Agriculture and other ways to encourage farmers who don't necessarily want to go in at that level of complete automation. But if you think that at one time a town like Harvey or Mott existed to be the local shopping place for a group of farmers, as you have fewer and fewer and fewer farmers, those towns can't maintain their existence because the implement store can't compete and the grocery store closes, and pretty soon the schools are consolidated and the town dries up. And you can drive around North Dakota today and see this happening everywhere. There's not so much out-migration in North Dakota right now as internal migration from the smaller towns to places like Bismarck and Fargo and Grand Forks and so on. And so this trend will continue, but I don't think it's in the interest of North Dakota to just accept it as if this is an inevitability. I think there are things that we can and must do, and I'm sorry to see our leadership so in love with this movement, because I think that if you take the culture out of agriculture and turn it into a kind of a robotic business where I could be actually farming from Maui in North Dakota or from Puerto Rico or Paris, who's going to be on the land? What's the size of the farm that you need to have to support a combine that's $850,000 or a new tractor that's $600,000? And so the pressure is going to be to grow, to consolidate, and there's going to be much more absenteeism, and that's going to mean a real collapse of rural culture. And I think that the great strength of North Dakota has been and still is the Harveys, the Cooperstowns, the Graftons, the Velvas, and that this is where the character of North Dakota continues to be nurtured. And I don't see it quite the same way in Bismarck, which I love, glad for our amenities. But I think now we wish sort of we were Maple Grove, Minnesota, which is, I think, the worst possible fate for North Dakota.
Sarah, you write about, at the beginning and at the end of your book about how North Dakota is either in another farm crisis today or approaching another farm crisis. Can you talk with us about what's happening today and maybe what lessons there are that we learned from the past, that we could learn from the past as we face this now?
Yes. There are in some respects, things that are different than they were back then. One big difference is interest rates are very low now. However, whenever I see a newspaper stories we have lately about inflation, and then inflation is going to affect interest rates, that could change on a dime. Interest rates could go up because I think interest rates today are pretty much variable. So that could change. Another big crisis is simply the age of farmers. There are many more farmers, I think over 70, than there are under 35. The challenges of getting started in farming are significant, which is why a program with as much imagination as the Resettlement Administration, which is kind of what I think Clay visualizes that the Bank of North Dakota could do, and it could. It absolutely could. It could help start. Just last week, a rancher farmer from just 6 miles from here, Gabe Brown, won a big national award, $250,000 cash prize, because of his work on soil regeneration. And a farmer like Gabe Brown doesn't buy off farm. He buys very little off farm. Fred Gersonman, who is my mentor, who was one of the first organic farmers, there's one exception to that. There's some German-Russian farmers who were so slow to adapt, they never got into chemicals. So, voila, they showed up in the 80s as organic. Really, seriously, there's a big cluster of them. They just never gotten around to it. But I think the future there is a future and for farming and ranching, and I think the pandemic and the supply chain problems and so on, and the cost of transportation and insecurity, those are all reasons why we need more emphasis regionally, regional supply chains, regional manufacturing. By the way, the Native American Agriculture Fund has a beautiful vision of like hubs, food hubs with regional processing and so on. It's very, very exciting. Other things are antitrust law enforcement. It's criminal that we have allowed the concentration in agriculture to get as bad as it is, both on the selling to farmers side, the seed dealers, pesticide dealers, and then on the people who buy from farmers. So there's monopolies and monopsonies. So the farmers are caught in the middle, and but for the support of the federal government, for the most part, they wouldn't be in existence. But I think we can tailor the support of the federal government to support not massive agribusiness, but rather family-sized farms. But it's going to take will to do that. I see Senator Conrad's brother nodding away. And that's something that Kent and Byron and Earl fought very hard for, as did Quentin Burdick, Usher Burdick. So many North Dakota politicians back then did exactly that. But now it seems that there's less heart in that fight. But politicians will pay attention when the people pay attention to the politicians.
All right. I wanted to shift gears a little bit to talk about a couple of other topics. Clay, you have an entire essay in your book that really talks about oil development in North Dakota, and you essentially lay out a blueprint for the way that North Dakota should regulate oil going forward. I'm wondering if you can maybe pick one or two of those ideas and talk with us about them and why you think that's the vision that North Dakota ought to have for this industry.
Well, thank you, and I should say my book isn't particularly focused on agriculture. It's really more about the culture of the family farm and its loss. But I'm fascinated by this and your suggestions about how we can encourage non-traditional agriculture. I wrote 2 chapters about this. One is on the Little Missouri River Valley, and my argument is, can't we save anything? I mean, is it all fungible? Is everything open for unrestrained development? And the answer appears to be yes. And I really lament that. I think that that's a profound failure of courage and imagination. So that, and my view is, 96% of the state is privately owned, compared to, say, Nevada, where 87% is publicly owned. And every state around us has more public ownership than North Dakota. We have this tiny little bit of publicly owned land, and I think we should tiptoe a little bit out there. So that's one thing. And then there's a second chapter on the oil boom, and I want to say that my argument is that the oil boom on the whole was pretty well handled. I'm not a severe critic of what happened, but there were problems, of course. And so what I'm asking for are just a couple of things. One is, and sort of say on the topic that Sarah represents, much greater support and protection for surface owners who don't own their minerals. They're the heart of North Dakota. They may not own their minerals. The minerals have been alienated at some point. The companies have way too much discretion and power in extracting that oil without, I think, sufficient respect for the lives of the surface owners. How about transparency in government? You know, our government regulators are essentially cheerleaders for the oil boom. They don't seem to me to be neutral regulators. They seem to be cheerleaders. And I have witnessed some of them in different agencies partying with CEOs of the oil industry in Medora and allowing the CEOs to pick up very large tabs. And I just wonder what would happen if those regulators were seeing partying in Medora with environmentalists. What that would look like in the state of North Dakota. And so we have this kind of weird double standard about this. And then third, I think that there should be an absolutely zero tolerance for repeated negligence. You know, spills will happen, things can go wrong. If you're pumping 1.2 million barrels of oil out of the state per day, there will be problems, of course. But there should never be a repeat tolerance of negligence. I think that that's a scandal. And finally, I think that something that's really wrong, and I have to say I blame the media in some part for this, Amy, that when there's a spill and there's a giant headline in the Tribune or the Forum that says such and such oil company fined $350,000 or $2.5 million. It sounds so good, and then a month later on page 7 it says, oh, it's been reduced to $2,200. And so I want the same size headline once they forgive all that, because it lulls us into thinking that we're being taken care of, when in fact those first numbers are almost never the final numbers, and we get the sense that someone's looking out for the public domain and for the state of North Dakota, and it turns out to be kind of window dressing. I know it's not as dramatic for editors at the newspapers when those fines are forgiven, but I think it's wrong-headed that we are allowed to believe that we're more punitive of negligence than we are.
Well, you have both me and my editor here in the audience tonight, so we will.
Should you wish for the citation of the Industrial Commission minutes where they adopted the policy of suspending 90% of every fine, I'll give it to you tonight.
Okay.
News release, breaking news.
I was going to say, speaking of the Industrial Commission. Sarah, when you were Agriculture Commissioner, you were a member of the Industrial Commission, which is one of the state agencies that regulates North Dakota's oil industry. Anyway, I would just be curious to hear your thoughts about some of Clay's ideas.
It's absolutely doable. All of those ideas, they should be done. There wasn't much going on in the oil patch when I was Commissioner of Agriculture. By the way, when I was elected, sometimes people send politicians gifts when they get elected. The North Dakota Petroleum Council canceled the membership of to the Petroleum Club that all previous Industrial Commission members had ever owned, belonged to, and they sent me a beautiful dish of cactuses. Which was all right by me. But it should not be that. It makes me sick, literally sick, to see what goes on now. All the Industrial Commission has been basically bought by the oil industry in particular, and to the neglect of all of the other parts of the West. And
This should be particularly galling to you because the Industrial Commission, consisting of 3, was created by the Nonpartisan League to protect the people of North Dakota from extractive industries.
I think that the question was, what are they doing wrong? But I loved being on the Industrial Commission because when I was on the Industrial Commission, we were able to do things like we created the PACE loan, whereby we provided low-cost loans to communities when they wanted to start a new business, not to communities, but to a business in a community that would be supported by that community, and it was like immense. It's still to this day the most successful program that the Bank of North Dakota has. We also had an Ag PACE loan, which was to start non-traditional agriculture projects on farms, as long as it wasn't wheat or corn or soybeans, but it was like something new and different. There was a guy down at the bank who got the nickname Buffalo Bob, because he made so many bison loans. And it was really exciting and it was dramatic. And nowadays there are those still programs going on. But there's not I think there's not the energy, there's not the innovation, there's not the assistance to people. But we have the tools here in North Dakota with the Bank of North Dakota and some of our other programs to really make a transformative changes in North Dakota. We had co-op fever going for a while. Starting co-ops, a lot of them failed, I gotta say. But people were trying, and some did make it. And so it was a period of optimism. We had Marketplace of Ideas with Ken Conrad, and I did that for many, many years. It was the largest rural development conference in America, and it went on for years. But I think there's plenty of places where optimism and change can occur. But I think there needs to be more receptivity to those things. When I was Ag Commissioner, when I started, we had 80 ag credit counselors working at the Ag Department so they could go out to farmers' living rooms and kitchens and sit and work with them on farm plans and sort of walk them through the complexity of the collections and the programs and the options that farmers had. Right now, I believe the Ag Department, last I checked, like 6 months ago, had one. And then they rely a lot on extension agents, but extension agents are neutral. They're not necessarily going to be just on the farmer's side. And there's a difference between a counselor, farm credit counselor who's an advocate, and a mediator who's neutral. If you're going to be neutral and you're in between a powerful bank and a farmer who is like suffering, and you're neutral, what's going to happen? You know, so we tried to be on the side of the farmer, not neutral. I'm not saying that the program it's a good program. There's a lot of good programs, but there's just not, I think there's not enough.
All right. I have one last question for you guys, and then we're going to open it up to, we'll take a couple questions from those of you in the audience. I wanted to end this where you end your book, Clay. You have an essay about how North Dakota should rethink its relationship with Native Americans, and you talk quite a bit throughout your book about North Dakota's relationship with Native Americans. I would just be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I think we're so blessed to have Native American communities in North Dakota. Not every state does. Texas, for example, Kansas, they basically pushed out Native peoples or exterminated them. We're fortunate in this regard. It enlivens the state. It creates some wonderful challenges. Native Americans are getting better educated. There's money in Indian country, and there are more lawyers and doctors and MBAs, and new leadership class has been coming. There's language restoration. There's cultural restoration. This is a good time, and it's going to be a better time for Native Americans. And they're going to challenge us, the non-Native Americans, who have just assumed that we don't really need to bring them under consideration much, which helps to explain the DAPL pipeline crisis of a few years ago. And so I talk about Native Americans throughout the book, as you say, Amy, and there are really two parts that I really hone in on. One is a trip I made to Medicine Rock, which is down near Leith, and how it's interpreted, and what it means to Native peoples, and who gets to decide what's sacred. And I'm hoping that we can learn from Native people to have a more sacred attitude towards our own place, towards North Dakota, because I think in some respects they have more to teach us than we have to teach them at this point. And I'm really thrilled by the things that particularly Mandan, Hidatsa Nation, and Arikara Nation are doing with healthcare and so on, including here in Bismarck. And then at the end, I go back to this and make a little list of things I think we should really do. And one is listen more. Just shut up and listen. And I think that's really important. I think we also know that Native Americans don't get worked up about everything, but the things they get worked up about, we really need to attend to. When they're worked up, when they're upset, when they're talking about the sanctity of their water supply, I think it's in our interest to really go out of our way. And I want to say that I think Governor Burgum has done a wonderful job in talking and communicating with Native peoples. And so there's that. I think that we need to be really careful about cultural appropriation. And that's when non-natives appropriate symbols, icons, lifestyles, dress, and so on without having earned it and without permission. I think we're pretty bad about that here. And I'm just talking about fighting Sioux either. And so there's anyone who wants to can see at the end of this book this sort of list of things I think we need to do. But above all, I think we need to listen. And I think that in the long run, industrial agriculture is going to be unsustainable. Look at the plight of the planet. And I think we're going to move towards a more decentralized, more Jeffersonian agriculture. And I think that people that can really help us understand that come very largely in the Native American community. Can I just say too, you in the introduction you said books about eccentricities and some serious things. I don't regard it as not serious about where the center of the North American continent is. I think that is.
It's very serious.
I think, you know, and the next algorithm is going to put it in Saskatoon, and then we're going to have to wage war against Canada. So I hope you understand that the world's largest prairie chicken is important.
My questions, if the audience was like kind of quiet or shy or something and didn't have any questions to ask, I was going to ask you where you thought the true center of North America was, but we'll see what their questions are first. All right, I'll open up to you guys. Does anybody have a question? I see your hand up over here, Jack.
Spoken, both of you, a lot about the farm crisis of the 1980s, and Clay mentioned Governor Sinner, who was the last Democrat to be governor of North Dakota. I'm wondering, from each of you, to what do you attribute the decline of the Democratic Party in North Dakota?
And I'll just repeat the question, since I know this is being recorded. A member of the audience wants to know, what do you attribute the decline of the Democratic Party in North Dakota to?
Please.
I think it's when the party does not listen to the convention. When all the people come in from the precincts and the counties, and they go to the state convention, and they, maybe other people think that they're not the wise, that they know something that the people don't know, that has, and I'll be no more specific than that. But I believe it will come back. I definitely do. Any day now.
Let me add on to that. What do you think needs to happen for the party to really return to where it was, a decade or more ago in North Dakota?
Well, I think some to a degree, we can look at times when things completely turned around before. Like North Dakota voted like 80% for Hoover, and then they voted 80% or so for FDR. And it's because FDR came in with a better program. So I think that some of these things can change, can turn on a dime. That's how come I can keep going.
I'll just quickly say, I think that the Democratic Party has, I'm with Sarah on this, has left behind a kind of local pragmatism, and is trying to, and wants to sort of be more like what it takes to be the national trends of the party. And that's one thing I think that since the Gingrich and Reagan revolution, rural America has been moving towards the right, sometimes at breathtaking speed. And the Farm Bureau has triumphed over the Farmers Union, and obsession about property has triumphed over questions of stewardship and so on. And I think that this is a national phenomenon that North Dakota has not really bucked or challenged particularly well. But I think that the Democrats of the state need to really listen to the actual needs of the people and realize that the people of North Dakota are on the whole much more conservative than the National Democratic Party, and so you need to choose. If you want to, and I mean no disrespect, but if you want to be Nancy Pelosi's Democrats, then you're going to have a hard time being Bowman's Democrats. And I think this is a mistake that the party has made, but I really mostly attribute it to this national rightward trend in which almost all of rural America now is red and reddening.
All right, so I get your hand up here.
First, I went to high school rugby.
So you're a rugby icon. Now, we know that's not the center of North America.
Technically, then it was
Baltimore.
Second, I was in the room the day that Kent Conrad asked him to run for Senate. And he weaseled out of that pretty quick. Third, though, is a suggestion that I know will never go anywhere. I've traveled to Norway. I stay in close contact with my family in Norway. Our family's been on the same farm there since about 1320. The sad thing is that will be coming to an end soon when my cousin passes away. Because in Norway, to own land and farm in Norway, you have to live on it 51% of the time. They do not allow any off-farm ownership. And if you die or retire, you are mandated to sell the house. So when my cousin passes away over there, none of his sons want to come home, and none of the other relatives want to come in. Over 700 years of legacy on one farm is gone. However, they heavily subsidize their farms there. There is no off-farm ownership. There isn't 20, 30 descendants own it. The people that live there have to farm it and live on the land. And if something like that could have ever been done here, think of what the landscape of North Dakota would be today.
You got to repeat that.
the whole thing. Well, let me just ask you guys to respond to that. What do you think of, if something like that had been implemented here long ago, what sort of state might we be in?
Well, I could speak a little bit to federal policy. For many, many years, the farm program payments were limited to smaller amounts to family farmers, to people who were actually family farmers. And then I think through corporate donations and politicians losing their moorings, those programs have been weakened, exceptions made, and now it's stunning how much money a particular farmer can get. And it's, I think it's problematic, and I think that an analysis of that and how some of these programs depopulate the countryside, not populate it. But a lot of this it isn't just accidental that it happened. I mean, there are consortia of companies that are executives and people who get together and who decide that there should be fewer farmers. I mean, there's open discussion about how if there were fewer farmers, there'd be more laborers, there'd be maybe more factory workers, and that was happening in the 70s. So, not to get all conspiratorial here, but I think a lot of these federal policies are not supportive of family farm agriculture.
All right, I think we'll take one more question. I see Jim, you had a question here?
Yeah, we've been going through some pretty depressing times. And you two are pretty optimistic people. Some would call you both dreamers from time to time. But I'd like to know from both of you, Clay and Sarah, what do you think is North Dakota's greatest opportunity right now?
All right, I'll just repeat it. What do you think is North Dakota's greatest opportunity right now?
Please.
I would say regenerative farming and looking at ways of farming where it takes less money and you don't need off-farm inputs like fertilizer and so on. Tree planting, there's going to be programs on tree planting. So I think some of those things have great potential. We have this, absolutely beautiful land. So I think that is, I feel optimistic about that. Plus we have our skills, our knowledge, the young people, the universities. I heard yesterday that from somebody who lived in Connecticut that they looked to NDSU for varieties of barley to make beer from. So this knowledge base is perhaps not being used much in North Dakota, but people all over the country are trying to make beer. So maybe it's more manufacturing of our own products, adjuncts to the state mill. Let's make bagels. Let's not just make wheat.
Well, the answer is Robinson, of course. But let that go. If you haven't been to Robinson to Bender's Bar, I have to say I've got a conflict of interest because I'm a board member of the Center for Determining Centers, which he's creating there. We're planning to export our genius about these things to all the rest of the world. So, but here are some things. The gerontocracy needs to retire and let young people take this state. We have a national gerontocracy that's choking us. But we also have a state gerontocracy, and I see the most interesting things happening amongst young people in North Dakota. And I think they want more, and when they want more, it doesn't mean necessarily a boat, a cabin, a jet ski, an ATV, etc. They want more. They want a higher quality of life, and they believe that Dakota should be more welcoming of eccentricity and diversity. And I think we need to get over some of the culture wars that we continue to fight in the state about same-sex marriage and gay pastors and the LGBTQ community and so on. I think that if we want to keep our young people and attract new ones, we need to make this place a vibrant, exciting, unusual, effervescent, creative, slightly weird sort of a place. And the studies show that cities which do this, which create this ethos, they thrive, and they don't just thrive culturally, they thrive economically. And so when I know some young people, I won't name them, but they say, I would never move back to North Dakota because I don't want to live in a state that is doing X. And you could decide what your X is, but there are lots of them. And so if the state were really saying, come here and lead us into the second half of the 21st century, and we're going to make that possible by the kind of loan structures we have, and working with farmers for apprenticeship programs, and carving out small plots of land so people could start a little CSA farm or something. You know, I go back once more to the Nonpartisan League. The history of the state has been the history of extraction. First it was beaver, and then it was buffalo, and then it was wheat, and then it was coal, and then it was oil and natural gas, but the state has been an extraction factory for the rest of the nation. And once in a while, the Nonpartisan League or somebody else rises up and says, we need to take better control of our own destiny. And the Nonpartisan League was astonishingly successful. It gave us the Industrial Commission, it gave us the Bank of North Dakota, it gave us the State Mill and Elevator. There's no reason why we can't assert our sovereignty in that creative way, rather than just by being grumpy about big government all the time. And so I want us to get a little radical and a little creative and let young people lead us into the future.
Amen.
All right. Well, I have just a couple of housekeeping items for everybody as we wrap up the discussion tonight. First of all, I do not believe that Sarah and Clay are actually selling their books tonight, but you can purchase them at local bookstores. I believe they're probably also available online as well. As you leave, rumor has it that there is a little surprise for everybody out that direction. I hear that it is edible. Hopefully it is good. Lastly, I wanted to thank again Humanities North Dakota and the Bismarck Library Foundation for making this event possible tonight. And thank you to the library for hosting us. And last but not least, can you guys just join me in a round of applause for coming?